Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simcha to the dogim in the deep blue sea. Simcha to you and me. Yeah.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we might not bring joy to the world, but we do talk about prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and our good friend Zeke.
Our good friend Zeke.
Rick, for the third week in a row, we're reading from Ezekiel for the Haftarah. I think that we know him well enough now to call him Zeke. This week is the last of the 4 special Haftarot that we recite before and following Purim and just before Pesach. And this week is Shabbat Ha-Hodesh, which is read just before Rosh Chodesh Nisan, which begins on Motzei Shabbat, Saturday night. The special Torah reading for the Maftir portion describes the rules for the first Pesach, which reminds us of the preparations that we need to get ready to take to get ready for Pesach. But we'll get to the Haftarah in a moment. I'm Larry Herman, and instead of my usual wine, I'm drinking a caipirinha today and talking Haftarah with my good chaver, the king of cannellation, Rick Muller. How are you doing, Rick?
I'm fine. Caipirinha? What do they make that from, piranhas?
Hardly. It's not a fish and it doesn't have teeth, but it does have a kick. It's a Brazilian national drink made from cachaça, sugar, and lime. It is sweet and delicious.
Have to have some sometime when we can get together. Enjoy it. So what does our good friend Zeke have to tell us this week?
Before I get to that, I want to comment on the differences between the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi readings. Usually, but not always, the Ashkenazi reading is a bit longer than the Sephardi reading, adding some verses at the beginning or at the end. But this week, the Ashkenazi reading adds 2 verses at the beginning and 3 at the end.
I guess they didn't want to take any chances.
Maybe, but I think it was more than that. The first 2 verses introduce us to the Nasi Yisrael, or the Prince of Israel, someone who is central to the rest of our reading. Actually, the prince is introduced first back in chapter 44 and earlier in chapter 45 before we take up our reading. It's not clear who this prince is. Is he the king? Is he the political ruler of Israel or Judea, suggesting that perhaps Ezekiel was foreseeing a leadership different than the monarchy or the priesthood? Is he the head of the Sanhedrin, which was established after the destruction of the temple? We don't know. But regardless, the Nasi is mentioned 11 times in our Haftarah. But the first 2 and the last 3 are in the extra verses added by the Ashkenazim. And I think that's why they added those extra verses, to tell us about the prince and make sure we knew that he was essential.
Very interesting. What's the connection between the Haftarah and Shabbat Ha-Hodesh?
Well, that part is easier. The Haftarah deals with the purification of the temple at the beginning of the month of Nisan in verse 18 of chapter 45. And it continues on with the Pesach offering, the Pesach sacrifice in verse 21. So in that regard, it's somewhat similar to the Maftir portion. But then we read on in chapter 46 about the rituals and processions for Shabbat, Rosh Chodesh, and the other festivals. It seems to me that we could have shortened the Haftarah reading and just read the verses dealing with Nisan and Pesach in chapter 45.
There you go again, second-guessing our sages.
Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Think for ourselves?
Sure, but if we didn't read the part in chapter 46, we wouldn't have the great choreography that's described. All the stuff about how the prince and the people enter and exit the court of the temple without bumping into each other.
True. The 2nd and 9th verses of chapter 46 have very elaborate descriptions of the comings and goings. And how do we know that it's all very important?
Because both of those verses have great trope.
Absolutely. And that means that we've got a trope drash coming, right?
How'd you guess? So we've got 3 Pazers in the whole Haftarah, 2 of them in the 2 verses you mentioned. I think it signifies the pomp and circumstance of the prince's entrance and movements. It gives a special legitimacy to his authority and connects government to religion. And the directions are real important, so there isn't a traffic jam on the temple grounds. You can relate to that since you're a transportation planner, right?
Right. I've never actually been asked to do a traffic design for the temple, but sure could.
But you could. And we also have a trope that indicate directionality. To bow low, lehishtach havot, it's given a revia, which goes down 4 notes at the basic. You can add to it, but it's basically 4 notes. Then you keep going down, exit by the south gate, like going through the Kiddush line after Shabbat services. You can't turn around and go back upstream. You're supposed to keep going one direction.
Yeah, I know some people who cut in and try to go upstream.
Yeah, it's just wrong. And then those 2 verses link up. Am haaretz, the ordinary people, are right there with the Nasi. So it equalizes, it democratizes the whole experience.
Well, I admit it's a Haftarah chock full of exciting trope. Gives me an idea. Maybe my next transportation plan can be written with trope. Anyways, has lots of my favorites in it. So, Rick, I suggest that we split the chanting up as follows. Let's start off with just 2 verses, verses 16 and 17. These are the 2 preliminary verses chanted by the Ashkenazim. We'll take a short break, and then we'll read the rest of chapter 25, verses 18 through 25. Actually, 45 I meant, not 25. And these verses connect the maftir dealing with the sacrifices and ceremonies for Rosh Chodesh Nisan and Pesach. Then we'll turn to chapter 26, and we'll read the bulk of chapter 26. Verses
46.
46.
Yeah.
Verses 1 through 15. These are the verses that describe the movements and sacrifices for Shabbat, new moons, and festivals. And then we'll close with the last 3 verses of chapter 46. And these are the second set of extra verses for the Ashkenazim that deal with inheritance for the prince. The Haftarah itself begins on page 1291 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash. Anything else special you want to note about the first verses before the bracha?
No.
All right, well, give us the bracha and let's read.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Kol ha'am ha'aretz yiyu el ha'truma hazot la'nasi be'Yisrael ve'al ha'nasi yiyeh ha'olot ve'hamincha ve'hanesech b'chagim uve'chodashim uve'shabbatot b'chol moadei Beit Yisrael hu ya'aseh et hachatat ve'et hamincha ve'et ha'olah ve'et ha'shlamim lechaper be'ad Beit Yisrael.
You know, Rick, if you don't mind, I want to go back to the 2 verses you just read. A couple of things hit me as you were reading them. The first is, there's a special trope on the very first word, yativ, and it's kol ha'am ha'aretz, all of the ordinary people. And I think that gets to the point that you were making about the democratization. All of the people, not some, but all of the people have to come to give their truma.
Yes.
The second thing I noticed is, boy, right in that second verse, verse 17, you got a bunch of special trope, including that Zarkas and Segols on the offerings.
Yes, on the mincha, and we were questioning whether that raises up the mincha offering to something more important. Grain, I thought I heard that it was just kind of a lowly kind of offering of the poor people. So to put a special trope on it, it raises its status.
Maybe the way some people think about mincha, don't show up for afternoon services. Anyways, before we get to the next set of verses, I actually have a comment on verse 19 coming up. So, verse 19 is where Zeke, our friend Ezekiel, describes how the priest applies some of the sacrificial blood to the doorposts of the temple. And this is in contrast to our Maftir reading, which describes how the individual Israelites, before the Yetziat Mitzrayim, when they were in Egypt, were to apply the paschal blood to the doorposts of their homes. Now, the commentary in Eitz Chaim, at the top of page 1291, notes that these are two different spaces. The temple is the communal space, and the home is the family space. Both are important aspects of our identities. We have obligations and attachments both to our individual identities and to our community identities. That's why on Pesach, we're required to feel as though we ourselves were part of Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus. I like the juxtaposition of both the role of the individual and his family and the community, the larger group with which he's associated. As the commentary notes, we must repeatedly consider how we live in both homes. Loyalty to hearth and blood of our own personal homes, and loyalty to our communal obligations in our communal home, the temple, or nowadays the synagogue. Both are important, even essential, even if there is sometimes a tension between them. And that's all I got to say about that.
Yep, that's great. Good stuff. So before the next section, the Zarka and the Segol on Koamar, Adonai Elohim, the pronouncement gets the rare trope, the attention getter trope in the beginning of verse 18, and then that comes back again the next chapter, the first verse there. So it's a formula that all the prophets use. They put the rare trope when they say, hey, and God says this, to capture the people's attention. In verse 21, you have a Zakef Gadol on Chag. It highlights the word holiday to attract people's attention to that.
Yeah, because it's attracting attention to Chag Shavuot, which a lot of Jews actually forget about.
Yes. And then there's a Pazera in verse 25 to really emphasize that it's the seventh month. Again, they're trying to impress upon the people, if you have a calendar and you set up these rituals and the holidays, it makes the year go by with festivals and happy things. You have to set that up. Planned happiness.
All right. Well, why don't you bring us back, take us again on starting with verse 18.
Ko amar Adonai Elohim barishon bechad lachodesh tikach parben bakar tamim vechiteta et hamikdash velakach hakohen midam hachatat venatan el mezuzat habayit vel arba pinot hazara lamizbeach ve'al mezuzat sha'ar hechatzer hapenimit v'chein ta'aseh b'shiva v'chodesh me'ish shogeh umipeti v'chipartem et habayit barishon barba asar yom lachodesh yiyeh lachem hapasach chag shvuot yamim matzot yeachel ve'asa Ha Nasi bayom hahu ba'ado, by himself, uve'ad kol am ha'aretz, with everybody else, parchatat v'shivat yemei chag ya'aseh ola l'Adonai shivat parim v'shivat elim tamimim layom, shivat hayamim v'chatat sirizim layom, umincha efa lapar ve'efa la'ayil ya'aseh, v'shemen in la'efa, v'ashvi v'chamisha asar yom lachodesh bechag, ya'asecha ele shivat hayamim, kachatat ka'ola v'cha mincha v'cha shamen.
Very nice. So, Rick, now we move to chapter 46, and it's a change of theme, a little bit of a change of theme, because we're not only talking about the Pesach. And I know you're going to want to say a few things about the Koamar, the Zarka again, but I'd like you also to talk about verses 2 and 9, which are both about the comings and goings.
Yes. So verse 2, you have the Pazer on Ha Nasi, the most rarest trope on the most important words. So the prince there, and then the directionality in verse 2, Vishtachava, he bows down, then he comes back up, go down, then coming back up. And then verse 3 is the same thing. Vishtachavu am ha'aretz, the people go down, petach, and they come back up at the opening of the gate. I can picture what the people would do there. They do it now on Aleinu. We bow down, we come back up, stuff like that.
Maybe we need you singing before the Kiddush to tell people how to get to the Kiddush table.
Sure. And then in verse 9, again, the Pazer, the prince is coming, the one who comes, but everybody is their own little prince. Everybody has their own role. And again, Lihishtacha there goes down with the Revia, the trope that leads you down. But it's an up and down thing. And then verse 10, the prince again has the importance there in that sentence. There isn't even a lead-in. It starts off with the et nachta, which is unusual, but it just it's a double highlight on that word.
Almost as though verses 9 and 10 were supposed to be recited together and not broken up at all.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. Sure. And then all the way down to 15. So again, the Zarka and the Segol in verse 9, verse 12, it just again highlights the importance of the ritual aspect of things on the Shlamim. In verse 12, it's got the most important trope there.
All right. Well, why don't you start us off with the first verse of chapter 46.
1 through 15. Ko amar Adonai Elohim sha'ar echatzer hapenimit hapone kadim yeh sagur sheshet yemei hamaseh uvyom hashabbat yipateach uvyom hachodesh yipateach. So the gate was only opened certain times a year. Uva Ha Nasi derech ulam hashar michutz ve'amad al mezuzat hashar ve'asu hakohanim et olato ve'et shlamav Vishtachava al miftan hashar v'yatsa v'hashar lo yisager ad ha'arev V'ishtachavu am haaretz petach hasha'ar hahu b'shabbatot uvechodashim lifnei Adonai v'ha'olah asher yakriv Ha Nasi l'Adonai b'yom HaShabbat shisha chvasim temimim ve'ayil tamim umincha efa la'ayil ve'lakvasim mincha matat yado v'shemen in laifa u'v'yom HaChodesh par ben bakar tmimim v'sheshet kvasim v'ayil tmimim yiyu ve'fa lapar ve'fa la'ayil yaseh mincha ve'la kvasim kasher tasig yado v'shemen in laifa uvevo Ha Nasi derech ulam hasha'ar yavo uvdarko yitzeh uvevo am haaretz lifnei Adonai b'moadim abba derech sha'ar tzafon l'ishtachavot yitzeh derech sha'ar negev v'haba derech sha'ar negev yitzeh derech sha'ar tzafona lo yashuv derech hasha'ar asher bavo ki nichecho yitzeh v'Ha Nasi b'tocham bevoam yavo uvtzeitam yitzeu uvachagim uvamoadim tiyeh hamincha efa lapar ve'efa la'ayil ve'la kevasim matat yado v'shemen in laifa v'chi ya'aseh Ha Nasi nedava ola oshlamim nedava l'Adonai ufatach lo et hasha'ar haponeh kadim ve'asa et olato ve'et shlamav kasher ya'aseh b'yom HaShabbat v'yatsa v'sagar et hasha'ar acharei tzeito v'cheves ben shnato tamim ta'aseh olah layom l'Adonai baboker ta'aseh oto umincha ta'aseh alav baboker shishit haifa v'shemen shlishit hahin laros et hasolet mincha l'Adonai chukot olam tamid ya'asu et hakeves v'et hamincha v'et hashemen baboker olat tamid.
Rick, snap quiz. How much is an ephah?
Don't know.
It's about a bushel. And how much is a hin?
Don't know.
It's about
Yes.
a gallon and a half.
Okay.
Weird measures. and a lot of very specific directions here in these verses.
Yeah.
But in any case, as you pointed out, it's the directionality and the organization of the traffic, which is very interesting. For other people, it's probably the specific equivalencies of all the different offerings on the different occasions, which are also interesting.
Yeah. The Baboker 3 times every day. It's supposed to be like a ritual kind of thing, and the details, the hin, the ephah, it gives the people something to hang on to. How do I do it? Where do I touch? What do I do? So it gives them something concrete.
Also provided some income or sustenance for the priests, perhaps.
Yes.
But in any case, we read the last 3 verses of the Haftarah, which, as I mentioned earlier, are somewhat disconnected to the rest, except they do talk about the prince and his inheritances. And I'll just note that, as you've pointed out many times, that Ko Amar has again another special trope on it, starting with a Ger Shaim, huh?
Yes. Not as strong as the other 2, but still the subheading, the title of the group of verses there falls under that. So there is some importance to it, but not as much as the other.
All right, Rick, well, take us home with those last 3 verses of the Ashkenazi version of the Haftarah.
Ko amar Adonai Elohim ki yiten Ha Nasi matana leish mibanav nachalato hi levanav tiyeh achuzatam hi benachala v'chi yiten matana minachalato leachad me'avadav v'haita lo ad shnat hadror v'shavat lanasi ach nachalato banav lahem tiyeh v'lo yikach hanasi minachalat ha'am lehonotam me'achuzato yanchil et banav lema'an asher lo yafutzu hami ish me'achuzato.
Rick, I just saw another connection for the last 3 verses, between the last 3 verses and the rest of the Haftarah.
Yes.
Especially that last verse, which actually is protecting the people. It says that the prince cannot take property from the people.
The
From the Am. Once again, we could give a drash on this, talking about the democratization and protection of the people themselves. But rather than go on, we'll conclude this version of Haftarah Plethora, wishing everybody a Chodesh Tov, starting on Motzei Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you next week, where for the first time in 3 weeks, we won't be reading from our friend Zeke. So Shabbat. And one more thing. You've got our emails at the bottom of the screen. We'd love to hear from you. And thanks to our good friend Norm for all the wonderful work he does with the with all the credits. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbos.